Hey everyone, it's Mark from Flight Sim School, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to do a steep approach in the BAE146, and my goal with this video is to go over the process that I use to prepare and fly difficult approaches like this one, so that you can apply those same concepts to your flights. The 146 is famous for flying the steep approach into London City, and I did consider using that for this video, but instead we're going to be doing the localizer to runway 15 in Aspen, which is actually even steeper at 6.59 degrees, and I think it's a lot harder because there's no glide slope for it because it's not an ILS. So this is going to be a ton of fun and a really good challenge. There are a few factors that will influence how successful you are for any approach, but when you've got a steep descent with an airport that's at an elevation between a bunch of mountains with a relatively short runway, two things that you can't afford to overlook is the performance of the airplane and its weight and balance. The BAE has 3 different variants, all with their own runway requirements and payload capacities, but unfortunately there's no performance calculator in the EFB, so we're going to have to guesstimate a little bit on what we can do. If you do have a landing distance calculator on the plane that you're flying, then make sure to use it because it'll give you a really good idea of how much runway you'll actually need based on the weather conditions and your current payload. For example, here we can see that we definitely cannot land the 737-800 safely into Aspen. For the 146, we should be all right because it has that unique ability for steep and slow approaches. And on top of that, I also double checked my numbers with a free calculator that I found on flightsim.to for it. And I'll include a link in the show notes to it in case you're interested in it. The first time that I try an approach like this, I always err on the side of caution, so I'm going to be flying the 100 variant because it's the smallest of the bunch and will therefore have the best landing distance as well. It needs about 3,840 feet to stop, and that's at sea level, mind you, but we should be all right because we've got almost 8,000 feet of runway at Aspen. On top of that, the later that you are on touchdown, the better stopping performance you're going to get. So what I'll do is tell SimBrief that we're only going to take 50 passengers today, so about 60% of its capacity, and we won't add any additional cargo by zeroing that out, and like that will be pretty light by the time we come to land, and that'll definitely help us out as well. The other thing that's important to check is your alternate. It defaulted to going back to Denver in my case here, which means it's going to add in a fair bit of extra fuel to fly all the way back there. So I can save on a fair amount of weight here by just picking a closer alternate that should be easier to land at if I can't make it into Aspen. The last thing that I suggest is to pick your cruise altitude yourself. SimBrief has a tendency to give you fairly high cruise altitudes, even for short hops like this one, and it's really best to use the minimum altitude that you need to safely climb to because it's going to simplify everything, including your descent, to set up for the approach. All the other settings are basically what you would do for a normal flight with SimBrief, so we can generate the flight plan now and we'll set all of that up in the airplane. I've already gone through a little bit of the pre-flight here, and to be clear, this isn't meant to be an in-depth guide to the 146. I'm really just focusing on the important details you'll want to know for flying complex approaches, but if you'd like to see more in-depth 146 content, let me know in the comments because I would love to produce some. I've imported the SimBrief plan into the EFB, and now if we go into the aircraft menu, we can see that once we updated here that our fuel weight matches what SimBrief calculated for us. And all I've got to do is just tweak our passenger count to 50 like we said we wanted, and we're going to be all set from a weight and balance perspective. Let's have a look at what we're going to be doing today. The route that SimBrief has for us is taking us out of Denver on runway 25. That'll line us up really nicely to fly the Connor 7 all the way out to the Werner transition. And then from there, we're going to go to the Red Table VOR just before flying the approach for runway 15 into Aspen. So as you probably know, the 146 just got a big update. However, I'm still using the modern FMS here just to keep things simple. But for what we'll be looking at, it's not going to make that big of a difference. It's really just some of the details of how to set it up that'll be different, but the concepts are going to be exactly the same. So you can see there's two different localizer approaches and two different RNAV ones. But for some reason, the only one that Navigraph has is the chart for the localizer E. So I'm going to pick that one because we're definitely going to be referencing this chart a fair bit as we come in for the approach. For the transition, our SimBrief route actually has us going by the red table VOR, so I'm going to pick that one because it lines up nicely with what we're doing. If it didn't, then I'd have to have a look at the charts, figure out which one of those transitions fit the best with our direction of flight and our route, and pick that one. Now, if we go to the lakes page, everything looks good all the way up to Warner, and then we run into a discontinuity before we get to the red table VOR. If we look at our route on the map, Warner is literally just beyond red table, about 12 miles down. So I'm going to delete the discontinuity and that'll fix that part of the route for us. Now, right at the bottom here and on the next page, we can see all of the waypoints of the approach chart. And on top of that, on the right side of them, we can also see the different altitude restrictions for each of those waypoints. This is one thing I always double check if I'm flying an approach with lots of steps that are going to happen in quick succession. The waypoint names should all match what you see on the chart, and most importantly, the altitude should match what's on the chart as well. These altitude restrictions are there to keep you away from the terrain, so it's important to respect them, and a lot of airliners are going to automatically level off to prevent you from descending below them accidentally. If any of the altitudes that you see here don't match what's shown on your current chart, you can update it so that it matches it. And for the most part, it really just means typing in the new altitude into the scratch pad and then loading it in with the line select key for the waypoint in question. That pretty much covers it for everything that you need to prepare for the approach for now. So I'll button up a couple more things, get airborne, and I'll meet you back in a couple of seconds here. The first thing that you should figure out once you're settled into your cruise is where your top of descent point is going to be, because if you don't get that right, it's going to be really hard to recover and get the rest of the approach right. This is where you're going to want to pull out your approach chart to get an idea of what your target altitude should be. We're coming in from the east today and we're going to be crossing red table, and it looks like we can be at 13.4 as we cross it on that next segment. So I'm going to use that as my target altitude for the top of descent calculation. At our current speed, it's telling us that we need to start down around 11 miles out from our target waypoint. And if we have a look at our flight plan, it looks like we've got just about 12 miles from Warner out to red table. So as we get close to Warner's where we're going to want to start down, but you can also give yourself more time as well. If it's your first time flying the approach, it's always better to start down just that little bit earlier. The other thing that I like to do ahead of time on a short flight like this one is to set up the radio frequencies that I'm going to need. For today, that's the localizer frequency 215 on both of the nav radios, as well as setting the final approach course, so that when things get busy, I can focus on just flying the airplane and switch the nav modes whenever I need them. Another thing that I find helps me a lot for this type of approach is to walk through each step of it and make sure I know what autopilot modes I'm going to use every step of the way and when I'm going to do certain things in the airplane. I won't go over all of those details here because we're going to see it as we fly the approach, but just know that that's how I would normally prepare for it, because everything happens very quickly when you're actually flying it, so make sure that you fully understand everything first. A lack of preparation is often what's going to lead to having to go around and try again. And speaking of which, it's also a good idea to get familiar with that go around procedure in case you need it. Alright, so with all of that prep out of the way, we're as ready as we can be to fly the approach. So this is where things get both fun and challenging at the same time. And it'll come as no surprise if you've made it this far that, again, the key to success is thinking 1 or 2 steps ahead. We're about 17 miles out of red table, so we're coming up on our top of descent point. Looks like our calculator is still saying we need to start down around 11 miles and we need 1600 feet per minute, so I can start prepping all of that now. First things first, we will set our altitude to 13,400, which is the level off altitude that we saw for the initial approach fix on the chart. And don't forget to arm the altitude if you're flying the 146, because otherwise it's just going to keep descending past the altitude that you've set. Next up, we'll arm vertical speed for the descent, and I'll use the command wheel steering with sync mode to set myself up at about 1600 feet per minute. It's hard to be very precise, but it should be good enough. And I'll keep an eye on our power and our airspeed, because I'm going to want to start configuring the plane really soon, because red table is just off in the distance there. One of the other keys to success is managing your airspeed properly so that you can configure for the approach early. And with that in mind, I always try to get the flaps extension speed just as I'm coming to the end of my descent, even if that means using the speed brakes a lot to be able to get there. You'll notice the weather today is really good as well, with no low-level clouds or precipitation, and this is what I recommend the first time you try a difficult approach like this one. And then when you want to increase the difficulty level, you can try throwing in a storm or more cloud coverage or whatever you feel like. Before things get too busy, I'll go set my landing bugs and my VREF speed. And on top of that, if the airplane you're flying has a ground proximity warning system, it's not a bad idea to disable it on approaches like this, because it'll be going off almost non-stop, which can be annoying and distracting too. Our little flip chart gave us a VREF of 111 knots for landing, which is fairly low because we're pretty light. So I'm going to target to be at around 120, 130 knots by the time we start the steep descent to the runway, just so that we're not too far off from our landing speed. Another thing to watch out for is when you level off during the descent like we just have here, if you don't have an auto throttle, it's very easy to forget to bring the throttle back up and end up slowing down way too much, which is very dangerous when you're flying in mountainous terrain like this. We're about 5 miles out from red table now, so I'm going to go to flaps 2 and I'll keep slowing the airplane down more to 140, 160 range, which will also have the benefit of giving us a bit more time on the approach so we can get everything right the first time. We're coming up on red table now. You can see it right ahead and see where it gets its name from as well. So to make the switch from LNAV to the localizer a little bit smoother, I'm going to set my heading bug to match our current heading, and then I'll switch into heading mode on the autopilot. The advantage doing it this way is that once I flip over our navigation source to nav1, which is our localizer frequency, it won't suddenly change headings on me, and I can make sure that everything looks right before changing into localizer mode on the autopilot. Our localizer needle is showing that it's ahead of us, which makes sense, and our DME is counting down as well, so we're all good, and I'll swap it over now then. Alright, we can see Aspen off in the distance there. The autopilot should capture the localizer signal any second now, so it'll turn inbound towards the final approach course, and at the same time we'll bring our gear down, and since we're at 13.1 on the DME now, we can start descending to our last step down as well. There are still a couple of step downs between Jargu and the final approach fix at Doip, but it's gonna be hard to follow them precisely because they're so close together. So instead what I've done is I've set my next altitude to the final approach fix, which is 11,700 feet. And then I'm just gonna keep an eye on the DME as we descend and cross-check it with the chart to make sure that we don't get too low. Let's go to flaps 3 now to help give us a bit more drag, and I'm using vertical speed for the descent again because I find it's the easiest to control in this airplane, and I'm very closely monitoring the airspeed though to make sure that we don't get too slow. Bringing the gear out really helps to improve the drag on any airplane, so if you're struggling to get your airspeed under control during the approach, bring it down as soon as you get below the extension speed, and that'll definitely help you out. As we get close to the final approach fix, we're going to put our flaps to full now so that we're fully configured for landing like we discussed. And the last thing we have to do is keep an eye on the DME. We're looking for it to hit 7.1, which is the point where we can start our last drop to the runway. On the chart, there's a table that says what vertical speed we're going to need for our final descent. Just be aware this is based on ground speed, not on indicated airspeed. And we're at about 170 slowing to 160 now, which is a bit faster than I'd like. So we'll start with 1800 feet per minute and then we'll adjust as needed. Looks like we're already going by 7.1 now. The autopilot's already off, so we can pitch to get around 1800 feet per minute and bring our power to idle. And we'll try and hold the descent steady there, but we're probably going to need to use more speed brakes to manage our airspeed because it's still a little high. My biggest tip for using the speed brake is to just keep your hand on the axis when it's in use, because if you don't, it's super easy to forget that you have it out and add more throttle when you don't actually need it, and it can get you into a fair bit of trouble in that situation as well. At this point, we're basically doing a visual approach, and when you're flying it on a clear day like today, you can actually fly the entire approach visually from red table, but doing it with the localizer and the DME just means that you can hand off some of the work to the airplane, and it just allows you to have a little bit more time to breathe. While I'm descending for the runway, the main thing that I'm keeping my eye on is the runway to make sure we stay aligned and we're looking good in terms of our descent rate. And I'll monitor my airspeed as well, because that's going to be pretty critical very soon when you're trying to land. And I'll either adjust my engine power or my speed brakes depending on the situation, but you need to be totally focused to get this right. This was probably my fourth attempt at this approach. On the previous ones, I still managed to get it down safely, but I got a couple of things wrong here and there, and I wanted to show you what an almost ideal approach should look like. There's nothing wrong with getting a hard approach like this wrong. It happens in the real world as well. It just takes a lot of practice to learn these skills that we've been discussing, so don't be afraid to go around if you have to and have another go at it. One tip I read with regards to the go around, especially in a 146, was to keep just the slightest little bit of power on and lean on the speed brakes a little bit more to control your airspeed, because like that the engines won't take anywhere near as long to spool back up if you do end up needing to go around. As you get close to the ground, you're going to want to shallow up your descent and use the PAPI lights to set yourself up on a more normal glide path. And this is one occasion where you want to try and set down right on the runway markers, especially if you're coming in heavy. Once you touch down though, make sure that you use everything that you've got to slow the airplane down. So the speed brakes, lift spoilers, and reversers if you're flying a plane that's got them, just so that you can preserve your brakes as much as possible. On this approach, I think they maxed out at around 350 degrees, which is pretty hot, but I also had one of the other approaches where they got up to 400, which really isn't that good. I hope you learned something useful during this approach, and if you did, please make sure to like the video and subscribe to get more similar videos to this one.